Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Whenever you happen stance into this incredible truth bomb riff about really probably one of the most important subjects that is happening in the world that unfortunately isn't being discussed nearly at the level that we're going to engage and entertain on this incredible conversation that I'm going to have with writer, attorney, shall we say, investigative journalist, a woman by the name of
Yeah.
Dennett, who has written a book that came to my attention that I just love the title. Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game of Oil. And we'll make that available in the notes below, as well as a bio, or excuse me, more information on that. But just a quick overview of Charlotte. She's the daughter of America's first master spy in the Middle East. She's a Burlington based author, investigative journalist, and an attorney. And her book is just out in paperback, which again is Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. Time magazine describes her as an expert in resource based politics. And Charlotte, as I was just discussing with you behind the scene, I'm from H Town. I'm from Houston, Texas. I grew up with both of the most important people in my life outside of my mother. But my father and my grandfather were both in the fossil fuel business. My grandfather was an
Yeah. Wow.
and my father was a general counsel of a large natural gas company, which is interesting, all things and LNG at this moment. But I
Very interesting.
I grew up with the knowledge of the business and
Hmm.
really the power of the business and really a lot of other elements of the business that incorporate the Texas machine, which it also fuels the military, industrial, and financial sort of apparatus, all of which have become one, which are kind of the backbone of the power of the mighty American machine. And yet here you are delivering this book that has incredible um, personal import because that's where you begin. Please,
Yeah.
a little bit about the sort of the evolution of this book and where you start from and kind of how that manifested and why it's important.
Well, evolution of the book. Just a couple of little facts here. First of all, I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and my father at the time was stationed there. When I was born, he was head of counterintelligence for the U.S. in the Middle East through the Central Intelligence Group, which was the immediate predecessor of the CIA. And he died in a mysterious plane crash after a top secret mission to Saudi Arabia. And I was an infant at the time. But later on, I became curious. For one thing, my mother, let's see, my mother raised me, but she died in the early 70s, and I decided to go back to Beirut, and I became a journalist there for the Beirut Daily Star and another organization called the Middle East Sketch, which had me traveling all over the world. I mean, no, all over the Middle East, writing about these new oil powers that were literally emerging out of the sand, like Abu Dhabi and Oman and United Arab Emirates. And so that was a mind-blowing experience for me. But then in early 75, the Lebanese Civil War broke out. I happened to be riding down a road in a taxi, and suddenly there's this big tank rolling towards us. We don't know what it's about. And everybody left the taxi, and I ended up in a school and saw parents dodging bullets, trying to get their kids out of the way. And then when nightfall came, one of the nephews of the children came back because he saw me there, and he said, "Let's get out of there. Come on, I'll help you get out." And we got out, but we dodged a bullet, okay? And I'll never forget that. His hand gripped on my hand, and he threw me into a car and rescued me. And that's a whole nother story if you want to come back to it. But the whole point is, after that, the Daily Star was very protective of me, and I figured, I might as well go home back to the U.S. and sit out the Civil War. and then I'll go back. I never got back. The civil war in Lebanon lasted 15 years. But when I got back, I started to regale my family about my experiences over there. And I was sitting in the living room with my brother, who's super famous philosopher, by the way, Daniel Dennett. Some of your viewers may know him. Recently died. But at any rate, I was telling him about everything I was doing, and it occurred to me that in a way I was kind of following my father's footsteps. And I knew that there was something in the attic, had to do with there was a steamer trunk there, and I'd spotted it as a kid, but it was covered with sort of fancy clothes. That's another story. My grandmother, who'd been in Turkey, and I never really explored. So I went up there and looked in this steamer tank, and it's full of scrapbooks. And suddenly I'm seeing photographs, letters, and so on, by my father and mother while they were there in Beirut. So that got me really interested. So I would say that the evolution of my book really began in the mid 1970s. And I've been pursuing it ever since. I mean, this is a big project, but for a while, I realized you may identify with this or not, but when I came back, it was really hard to report the truth on the Middle East. It was so censored. I met my future husband in New York City, and which where I ended up living. After Beirut, I couldn't live anywhere else but New York. Beirut was fantastic in those days. It was a beautiful, beautiful place, very exciting, culturally alive. Now it's destroyed. Practically, it's a failed state. But when I was there, when I came to New York, I said to my husband that there's no issue more censored than the Middle East, and I had come to learn why that is. Um, when I was there, Beirut and Lebanon was described as the gateway to the Middle East to most tourists. But I had come to know that it was, according to oil people, it was the gateway to Middle East oil. Why? And here I have to show the cover of my book. It's deliberate because if you're going to understand the conflicts in the Middle East, you've got to have a map. That really helps. And by the way, there are 12 pipeline maps in my book. But here, let me show it up to the camera if I can. Um, there you go. Now, this is the Eastern Mediterranean along here, and you will see lines. There's a line there, a line there, and a dotted line there. The dotted line is the projected route of the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which my father was working on at the time of his last mission to Saudi Arabia. That was in March 1947. And the two other pipelines were built in the 1930s, and they are carrying the oil of Iraq to the Mediterranean coast. And one of the terminal points is in Lebanon, and the other terminal point is in Haifa, Palestine. So the reason that I got onto that map was, my first place of investigation of what was behind this top secret mission to Saudi Arabia. Of course, I looked at the New York Times, and lo and behold, I found this absolutely fascinating article, and I think it would still be fascinating to people. It was published on March 2, 1947, in the Sunday edition of the New York Times, and the title of it is Pipeline for U.S. adds to Middle East issues. And then the subtitle is Oil Concessions Raise Questions Involving the Position of Russia. Russia. So the Cold War started way back before people really acknowledging it happened. And there was this great map. I'll just show it to you for a minute, but here's the headline, and there's a great map in there. And that's when I started looking at these pipelines. And then one of the things that it said, and I'm going to read from it, put my old specs on here. Um, Protection of that investment and the military and economic security that it represents inevitably will become one of the prime objectives of American foreign policy in this area, which already has become a pivot of world politics and one of the main focal points of rivalry between East and West. So when I saw that the one of the pipelines terminated in Palestine, that kind of blew my mind. And then this whole article, it's really about the great game. It's about the United States coming on as a major power in the Middle East, which had formerly been dominated by the French and colonial powers, and it was going to establish the United States as not only a major power in the Middle East, but in the world. Why? Because it had an exclusive concession with Saudi oil, and the rich vein of Saudi oil was known then. My father wrote about it in his last report, and this just put the
Before you
U.S. on
do
the
it,
map. And
before
it
you do
also,
that, but can I interrupt you real quick to ask you a couple of quick questions?
sure, sure.
So, because I could tell just by, where you're going. I mean, I could listen to you for probably a couple of years without interrupting because
I'm sorry. Yeah, I went on too long.
no, no, it's not too long. It's perfect, but my mind is swimming with questions where I want to be able
Go,
to calibrate a couple of things if we may, just
sure,
because I don't want to take you off the path, but at the same time, just a couple of things off the top of my head. First of all,
sure.
kind of an irony. My last name is Lovell. He was, I can't remember his first name, but he was one of the chief architects of the OSS, which is, of course, what preceded the CIA.
Yeah, yeah.
Going down that path. But
Wow.
I was reminded of Lawrence of Arabia, right? In the
Yeah.
English ministry of, all of the different satellites that were operating in that time period and that whole story that precedes what you're talking about, that your dad was in the midst of, that you stated that he died in a plane crash in 1947 with all of these elements starting to transpire, right? So, first and foremost, as you're kind of digging into this, I think there was a quote that I had read that the oil has to be protected above all else, or
Oh,
something,
yeah.
right?
Yes.
So, can you
My
kind of
father wrote that.
that's so given that he had that knowledge as early as 1947, and I know you have information and you wrote a previous book on the Rockefellers, and of course, we're an emerging superpower at that time, all of those things that, transpire after the meeting at Yalta between Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill and so forth. But, when we're talking about the Gwar find and all of the knowledge of what was laying underneath the sands of Saudi, right? I
Mhm.
mean, am I to kind of assess that based on where you start this journey, which sounds to me like almost like Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of setup, right? Like you were talking about this incredible, thing that you found with all of the pictures and going back to the heyday. But when you started to really uncork this bottle and you started to delve in, does it seem now that they would have understood the impact of the region for as long as it's maintained itself? I know that's kind of a leading question, but they knew at the beginning it had to be protected at all costs. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, using that term, you see, I had to see this. I sued the CIA for documents under FOIA, and I got a wonderful document back called Analysis of Work, which my father wrote in 43 when he was about to go out there. And then he was with the OSS. It became the Central Intelligence Group later. But and it was just amazing because it was heavily, heavily redacted. But for some reason, the redactor's pen missed this key line. And what was his objective? Well, the key one was he said we must protect the oil at all costs, and he meant Saudi oil. Later on, the his last report and his last letters home. I found the last letter home and the last report in the steamer trunk. And in the last letter, he was just marveling over because he'd given the grand tour of this American encampment in Saudi Arabia, and he was marveling over no one can really fathom how much oil there is here. They kept it secret for quite a while, but they knew. And I can't hear you.
I'm just, I've never understood how they knew what the find was at that time period without the technology for the geo, all of the coordinates and what it would do and how long it would produce, right?
Oh, yeah.
But we both know the war machine of Germany, for example, ran out of gas, literally and
Yeah.
figuratively, right?
There
So,
you go.
so
No, I
then
mean, that's so important. That's crucial. What you said, if you, would you like me to address that,
well,
what
yeah,
they knew about
I'm just
Germany?
thinking if you can just square because this is a really fascinating thing that I've never heard.
Okay.
The powers that be that manifested the OSS that would become the CIA knew
Yeah.
from the beginning, post World War II, of how enormous the find was and what that
Yeah.
would do to geopolitics for the next however many decades they planned out. I'm just kind of
Right.
curious who knew what, when, and how did they? I mean, it's clear how ultimately what the outcome is, but I'm just wondering from where you're sitting, looking back at it, if you could even imagine, because you know all of the things I'm thinking in my head, the wars. I mean, I'm thinking of everything, right? Over the course
Right.
of the last, I mean, can you try to quantify that for me from what you were?
Oh, well, I can't tell you. I mean, no one's ever asked me that, but you being in the business, of course you would. But I can just say that he himself was amazed. But this was discovered in 38, I believe. So we got 10 years into it. And they had already started establishing this huge American compound in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, where they were going to pump the oil. And what was key for them was this pipeline. I mean, this was what he was really focused on, and what they were all focused on, because when you build a pipeline, you need to know how to protect it, right? One of his colleagues at this time, I found this in the book, actually called the Trans-Arabian Pipeline the artery of empire. That kind of blew my mind. And they are. They absolutely are, because oil is the fuel of the military. This is why you don't hear about it. It remains sort of national security, okay? So, and they've got to protect it. The easiest way is through pipelines or also tanks. So, but what land is it going to run through, and where are they going to discover resistance? And I might add, this is something that goes back to the conquest of the American West. You're sending out feelers and scouts, and you want to know whether the hostiles are going to fight it. And in the 30s, those two other pipelines that you saw on the map, they'd been sabotaged, okay, because there was the Arab revolt going on at the time. They were revolting against colonialism, British colonialism, French colonialism, and one of the targets was a pipeline. So they had to determine a safe route for the pipeline. Hence, we must protect the oil at all costs. And I didn't really answer your question about how much oil they knew was there. I can simply tell you that they knew it. They knew it was very big, to the point that they did not announce the pipeline until 1944. And I talked to some people who had been there at the time. They said they kept it secret. Because they knew once it became known, all the other powers were going to try to vie for it, and that included the French and the British and the Russians. And one thing that I learned is that by the time my father is there, he's not spying on the Germans because they'd already been basically wiped out and removed from the area. He was spying on our erstwhile allies, the French, the British, and the Soviets, and they were all intensely jealous of the fact that the United States had got this exclusive concession. And there are books written about all the deals that went on, and how the British were outfoxed. In fact, the Philbys. Did you ever come across St. John Philby and Kim Philby? Kim Philby was the most famous spy of the 20th century, and his father was very close to King Ibn Saud, and he had been informed. He told the British that you should support this guy Ibn Saud, and the British decided to support another prince in the area, and that was their biggest flaw. So who be,
So you're saying the American intelligence were able to usurp the British intelligence, even though we
yeah,
can.
yeah,
Well,
yeah. They were
that's
able to,
fascinating. That's
and
fascinating.
the person who did that was a Brit, and the British were furious at him. They didn't trust him after that, but he still had a very close relationship to Ibn Saud, the king. And one of the things I found out is that Kim Philby, I'll use spy people, know that he's the most famous. He was a double agent. He worked for the British, but he was also really spying for the Soviets. And he was stationed in Turkey in the summer of 1946 when my father was in Beirut, and they were direct counterparts. They were both in charge of counterintelligence. He for the Brits, my father for the Americans. What is counterintelligence? It's spy hunting. You want to keep the spies out of your organizations and you want to penetrate theirs. So this had this other huge dimension. Let me share one other thing I got. Well, many things I got out of his last report and his last letter home. Um, he became, after he had this tour, one thing he noticed is that whenever the king needed something, the king didn't turn to the American government officials. No, he turned to Aramco. He turned to the oil company. Like if the king needed a flashlight, he'd call, the oil company. And my father said, that bothers me. That's like it's almost like the American oil company is acting like the British East India Company, which was this big colonial enterprise that the British used throughout the world. And so that to me was like the first indication what rules our policy. Is it the government or is it the oil?
Well,
I'll
it's
conclude
it's
for you.
crystal clear in 2024. But let me backtrack a little bit to ask you a compounded question to get you into kind of the chronology of explaining your book. And I want to remind the viewers too, and I'll post this again in the notes. But the book is called "Follow the Pipelines: Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics for the Great Game of Oil" by Charlotte Dennet. And look, there is no bigger story. This is the story because it's going to lead into a lot of other things. Hopefully, we'll be able to talk about in the time frame that we have. But I want to ask you this to kind of let you run with it, and then hopefully I'll be able to intercept and ask you some questions that I need to get answers to. But just to kind of set the table, so we're talking about, and you just made the most poignant point that the Prince of Saud knew who to go to that could generate policy, and this is long before Citizens United and the clear corruption that we're in the midst of right now, where we all know the billionaire class has absolute control, which I would argue is a result of what you just said after decades and decades of manifesting the scenario. But let me just set this up to see where it goes. So, look at this time period. The United States was the largest producer of oil in the world before World War II, and of course we were depleting our resources out of California and Texas, and all of our theaters and everything that we were in the Pacific and the needs and the construct. And so they find this ginormous find in Saudi, and they're working through the whole pipeline matrix, which seems to coincide at the end of World War II, which is of course all of the carnage of, among other things, the Holocaust, which then leads to the creation of Israel. And we know about the Balfour Declaration, back in, I can't remember the exact date, but it was,
1917. I can talk about the oil connection to that if you
right,
want, but go ahead.
but exactly. But you also mentioned the Rockefellers, and I don't want to go into the whole treatise of the specificity of the historical claim. I just want to set the precedent of the flow here because of where we are in 2024. And I know most people are probably thinking about Gaza, and they're thinking about potentially, which has been in certain sectors pretty well known that there are finds off the coast of Gaza, like you had prefaced from Haifa, natural gas, but all of these geopolitical matrices that also include finance, which is what I want to get into eventually. But there's this geopolitical evolution of all of these power players for an outcome that obviously your book reveals what your father knew back in 1947 before he disappeared in a plane crash, which, if you look at everything in the last 15 years, that's not a coincidence for most major players that go down in plane crashes, Prigozhin being the most recent, right? So,
Oh my God,
I
yeah.
mean, it's just,
There, the value of plane crashes to those who want to assassinate is it's really hard to figure out who done it or what happened. But go ahead.
absolutely. But I mean, you get the chronology here. I'm wondering if you can take us through that kind of, I set the table here that the United States is now evolving into a superpower. It's going to become the Cold War. They know this huge find. Obviously, resources were depleted elsewhere, and they have this long vision. But there's also this manifestation of the human tragedy of the Holocaust, Israel, all of the things that
Yeah.
manifest that have never been fully resolved without this question of oil and resources in the region and the power players. Can you kind of construct that based on what your book, I think,
Yeah.
evolves?
I'd love to, and I'm so glad you're interested. Um, Let me set it to let's go back to those two pipelines I was pointing to. I'm just going to review it again. They're they're these two ones here, and one of them ends in Haifa. Now, I began to wonder, well, they were built in the 30s, but when were they conceived? And then I went back, and then I went back into World War One, and I found out, and then I went back even farther. I went back to 1911 when Winston Churchill was the admiral of the British Navy, and he had to make a decision, which was he he realized that oil fuel was more efficient and it was cheaper and it was going to make the boats move faster. So he had to make the decision to convert the British Navy from coal, of which the Britain had lots of, to oil, which had none. And he even predicted when he knew he had to convert the Navy that he was going to have to fight, quote unquote, on a sea of troubles. And the first trouble, it was during World War One, and the primary, quote unquote, first class war aim was the oil of Iraq. All right, I mean, they knew about the oil, it was bubbling up from the surface. And if you look at the whole story of Lawrence of Arabia, for instance, teaming up with the Arabs against the Turks who controlled the Middle East prior to World War One, the whole idea was get out the Turks and get that oil of Iraq, which the British succeeded in doing. Then in the 30s, they finally built the pipelines. And what happened after World War One is there was this creation of the British Mandate and the French Mandate. These were colonial enterprises that were supposed to help the region develop itself. And the Brits controlled the southern pipeline to Haifa, okay? And so they had to think about where was a safe place for the pipeline to end. They chose Haifa. And who was going to protect the pipeline at all costs? European Jews. That was the plan. And I have now found that there
Wow, that's
is
interesting. That's
oh
interesting.
yeah, yeah, there now finally there are Israeli scholars getting into their own archives, and I quoted one of them who found a document that was discussing where that there was the pipeline element to having a safe place. They didn't trust the Arabs, you know, towelheads, whatever, brown people. They trusted European Jews more. So that was the plan, and the Balfour Declaration, which again never gets discussed as it should. Most people, particularly Jews who settled in Israel, think of the Balfour Declaration as sort of the first really official British acknowledgement that there should be a Jewish home in Palestine. And the whole presentation was that Jews had been persecuted and they needed a safe place to live in Palestine. And I have to say, I remember one of my Jewish viewers was telling me after she read my book, she said, I'd always wonder why do they care so much about the Jews? The British were anti-Semitic to the core, you know. And here they are saying they're creating a homeland safe for the Jews. No, they wanted the Jews to protect the friggin' oil. So anyway, that and I think that may be for you. You're saying, you know, you can conceive of it. I think it's a painful thing for Jews who, you know, lost
Well,
loved
I
ones in
think
the
most
holocaust.
Jews, I think most Jews understand geopolitics and money as well as anyone, especially scholars and those that are in the business, right? I mean,
Well,
without the resources, the world doesn't work. Everybody knows that. On top of
mm,
genocide, I mean, that's
not
absolutely
everyone.
well.
Not
But
everyone.
the worst part of it is that's been our reality for centuries. I mean, you know, and it's just gone on overdrive. But I see what you're saying. It's a sensitive subject because of the nature of the Holocaust, and then of course the return and what that means, you know, ideologically. Not to mention because of the pogroms and 1,000 years of persecution, religious persecution. But see, this brings up a whole lot of other elements because I mean, we could go through every policy. We could go through every war. We could go through every conflict of the Middle East, going back to 67 or 48, right? In every single one of them, we could parse out something that has to do with what you're talking about, that would
Yeah.
undergird this, right?
Well,
But
there's a really important one about how FDR failed to rescue the Jews. I could go into that.
well,
It's
please do
oil.
because that
All
sets the
right.
table in a big way. Boy, does that
All
set the
right.
table.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
please
yeah.
do.
I have to credit my husband, Gerard Colby, who is probing this more deeply. His father was of German origin, and he was horrified by the Holocaust and felt very guilty about it and wanted to probe. Anyway, we worked together, but he's working on that project. It's called Oil in the Holocaust. But at any rate, that's the name of his project. What happened is that in 1943, the genocide, finally became confirmed, very much known in the United States. And the whole question is, what are we going to do about it? And so one of the plans was to send, I mean, the killing machines are already in place. And one of the plans was to possibly bomb the death chambers of Auschwitz. And it was nixed by John J. McCloy, who was, if I recall, head of the Air Force, I believe. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact title of him, but he was very important. And he said, no, we're not going to bomb the camps because that would distract us from our main mission, which is hitting IG Farben. Later on, that was proved to be absolutely false. That IG Farben was just miles away from Auschwitz. He could have. Now people will say, "Why bomb the camps? That's going a lot of people are going to die." The fact of the matter, there were Jews in the camps who were literally pleading to have them bombed because they knew a lot of them were going to die anyway, but at least it would stop the killing machine. Now, why did the Americans not bomb the camps that would stop the killing? Because then they figured out where were the survivors going to go. A lot of them would want, because of Zionism, would want to go to Palestine. And there was a problem, and it was Ibn Saud. Ibn Saud sent some very stern messages saying, I don't want them coming to Palestine, period. And if you allow these rescued Jews to come to Palestine, you're going to lose possibly your oil concession. So FDR had to make the painful decision not to bomb Auschwitz, not to help the Jews until later. He finally sort of resolved the question in 1945. It was shortly before his death, with the famous meeting in Bitter Lake, but where he met Ibn Saud, and they had this long talk. And once again, the whole details of that meeting have not been disclosed until fairly recently. Um, and they worked out a deal. They worked out. I mean, there were efforts to persuade Ibn Saud to become the leader of Palestine, and he wouldn't do that. But Ibn Saud and FDR worked out a deal whereby the U.S. would be very helpful in developing Saudi's oil and protecting the pipeline. And in return, Ibn Saud would allow immigration of Jews. So in the end, FDR worked it out. But meanwhile, millions died. So that's just an example of a connection really between oil and genocide. When is the decision made to put human rights over oil needs? And one of the things I found, like the Armenian genocide that happened in World War I, there's an oil connection to that as well, which I describe in the book. Yeah, and one of the origins of World War I, where the Germans were moving from Turkey towards Iraq and towards Iran through the Berlin to Baghdad pipeline. I mean railroad, and that the deal that was struck between the Turks and the Germans is that if the Germans help build this railroad, the Turks would grant oil concessions to either side of it. So it was a mutually beneficial thing. And who was used in the labor to help build that pipeline were Armenians. And then later, Armenians were dispossessed and well, killed, genocide. And because the I'm sorry, I said pipeline, I meant the railroad was going to go right through some of their land, and they got um, ethnically cleansed as well. A lot of them ended up in Syria, but yeah, there's a book on that, and suddenly it's escaping my mind. I'll try to remember it later, but it's one of the first books that shows an oil connection to the Armenian genocide. So, we can fast forward up to the present,
Well, hold on
and
one
we've
second before
got,
you get there, because I think I
yeah,
want to bridge this. Because look, we've known throughout history, he who has the gold makes the rules. But what the reality is, he who has the oil pipeline makes the rules. Because there's a couple of other elements that we should parse here and consider as we get towards the latter third of this interview, and maybe I'll even suggest talking it and making it a series. But look, more recently, a lot of us remember, okay, what is Afghanistan now to the American empire, really, after 9/11 into Iraq and Afghanistan, and we started to see all these different pipelines and who was involved with some of these other companies that you mentioned. And we always know that they're behind the scenes. In the first Trump administration, his Secretary of State was Rex Tillerson. We know what
yeah,
Gazprom was all about back in those situations, and the
yeah.
whole global circumference of this thing. The thing that I want to hear you try to, and I don't think it's in the book, but I wonder if you can maybe weave this in if you have any thoughts on it, right? So when we had Bretton Woods in 1971, the idea was to get off the gold standard to create fiat currency, but was presumably based on the commoditization of oil, i.e., the global oil standard, right? So the United States, there's a lot of discussion about the United States and Saudi. At that time period, Saudi began trading all of its flows in American dollars. And then, of course, for those who understand finance, that gives us a very intriguing position as the world's global currency. And then ultimately, we can finance certain things based on fiat currency and all sorts of scenarios by way of treasuries and bonds that all kind of evolve from the capital flow of oil. Now, simultaneously, though, we've had technology over the course of the last 25 years that has seemingly been able to put together a paradigm change pre 9/11, quite frankly, to where geothermal and wind and solar and new technology and the infrastructure and everything else could conceivably have us a majority, maybe a vast majority, maybe 70 to 80% fossil free in terms of our energy paradigm in the United States, minus, of course, airlines and things like that that we don't have real answers for. So you've got the global paradigm of the dollar, you've got the flow of capital, you've got the geopolitics, you've got all of these elements that we just talked about between these conflicts, right, that never seem to end because they're all evolving under the same infrastructure. But the reality post 9/11, right? I guess the question that I want to ask you is we were on a pathway to potentially reboot the global energy infrastructure that was less dependent on fossil fuels. But ever since 9/11, we went backwards. Ever since 9/11, we had 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi. We know a lot of information about where the terrorist cells were in the United States at that time. We know who was funding them. This is all information that the FBI and the CIA weren't sharing. We know about the asymmetric information. For those of us who know the story, the general public doesn't know the story, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of manifestations of October 7th that follow the same trajectory. So
Yeah.
you've got Gaza, if you're, some people, the world's largest prison, or however you want to look at it. But at the same time, it was one of the most highly defended locations in the world with incredibly high end surveillance. And then suddenly this whole thing happens. And the New York
Yeah.
Times reveals after the fact that, Israel had the information long in advance. I don't want to speculate about all of those details other than to say that all of these elements have led right back to your paradigm, which you've got to protect the oil above all else, which means everything else is expendable. Can you try to bring all of those things together based on your work and what that's led you to?
Whoa. You're packing a lot. I'll try. Um,
Global
First of all, not
finance, global
oh,
finance.
global finance. Well, first of all right, let me get to this. Not so much global finance. I feel more comfortable talking about this key factor, and it really applies to Gaza, okay? And that is no no financial institution is going to support an infrastructure project such as a pipeline, which is a massive infrastructure project. I might say the Trans-Arabian pipeline in its day was the biggest industrial venture in history. It's just running this pipeline.
That's right.
Okay, so they won't do that if there's unrest.
No.
Okay, so how do you how do you solve that problem? Look what's happening in Gaza. You're going to demilitarize, de-radicalize, um, kill all the Hamas, obviously, and transfer the whole population out of there. That's that's the end game. It never gets discussed. That is the end game, and it's been contemplated before October 7th. Netanyahu in had two different strikes against Gaza. One was in 2009 and the other was in 2014. Why? Because by then they had discovered huge amounts of oil and natural gas off the coast of the Mediterranean Sea to the amount of $500 billion worth. Okay. So suddenly Netanyahu's dream, which he has held for a long time, of developing an energy corridor along the whole eastern Mediterranean so that he can exploit these riches and shoot them up to Europe, which right now is desperate for more alternative supplies because of the war in Ukraine. So that Ukraine and Gaza are connected now. So that's it. But I will tell you that Netanyahu was a big cheerleader of Bush going into Iraq. And shortly after the troops landed in Iraq, Netanyahu bragged that soon the oil was going to be flowing to Haifa. Well, what did he mean? You know, that pipeline that I showed you, the Iraq petroleum pipeline that went to Haifa, it was closed in 1948 due to the Israeli War for Independence. And he wanted it to be reopened, reconstructed. And so that was also part of his big dream is to tap into the oil of Iraq. And what did that require? First of all, you had to overthrow Saddam Hussein. You wanted someone in there that agreed to this. And so they picked an Iraqi exile person named Ahmed Shalabi, and Shalaby said, "Yeah, yeah, I'll let the pipeline go through," and but it didn't happen. And Netanyahu said it was going to flow. This is not a pipe dream, but it was a pipe dream. And the main reason is Ahmed Shalabi was the guy that came up with the weapons of mass destruction pretext for invading Iraq.
I did not know that. I
Yeah,
didn't know that's where it emanated from. But see, what's so
yeah.
interesting, you know what my mind went to originally, the point that you made earlier in this dialogue, where the Prince of Saud decided to go to the Saudi Aramco, and I didn't even know they called it Saudi Aramco at that time. I thought that evolved later, but to generate the policy, because you got to bring that full circle, and this is what I've been going on about for 22 years. Again, we knew where the hijackers came from. We know where they were in the United States. We know who funded them. It was Prince Bandar bin Sultan's wife who was providing the material support for the sleeper cells of 9/11. That both the FBI knew exactly where they were and the CIA knew exactly where they were. For what outcome? Weapons of mass destruction? Think about what you just said. I mean, my God. And it goes to October 7th as well, right? Look, he who
It goes to October 7th. Here's the other link. There's a lot of evidence that the Bush administration knew that the Twin Towers were going to be attacked
Well, that's what I
in
just said.
advance.
That's what I just
Yeah,
said. That's
yeah,
the whole point.
right.
They knew exactly where the sleeper cells were, and I'm
So
and I,
they needed a pretext.
right. They
They
didn't have
needed.
any, and also there was this whole thing with the neoliberals that said there had to be a spectacular event. But to your whole point of what you're talking about, okay. But see, here's the other side of it that we couldn't explore. But I want you to think about here real quick, okay? So think about this, right? Yeah, it's all about the oil. But the oil is all about the global finance from being the dollar's reserve currency because
Yes.
not only did 9/11 happen the way it did, but we also had another terrorist attack on the United States that was even larger, just a different array in how it all played out. But it was the 2008 great financial crisis that
Hmm.
destroyed the real estate market of the United States because it was all fraud. But the whole thing that was baked in and that nobody understands, and I want to bring this full circle to your final point, because this is where my work intersects with your work. Okay. So after the great financial crisis, which was the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, okay, it landed in Congress to try to supposedly manifest an emergency stimulus to be able to save global markets. Okay, that was called
Hmm.
FART. But that was just a drop in the bucket to what happened. What happened behind the scenes was the Federal Reserve met 98 times to be able to provide, at that time, 29 trillion, then 33 trillion total, backdoored to the financial apparatus that had gone bankrupt because of this ginormous global fraud, then an additional 16 trillion because of some other things that happened. I don't want to go into too much detail. But all of this is predicated on the position of the ability of the United States as the global reserve currency to finance its way out of scenarios, but by through fiat currency that's based on the global oil standard. Okay. So when you have the flows and the capital flows and the control, and the world is that is the gold standard of commoditization of oil, so that ultimately all of the smash and grab techniques, in addition to the war and the genocide and the pollution and all of these other things that come from it as well. But the global paradox and paradigm is that when you have the powers that be, and we're seeing a double down on it right now because of all things that are going to happen between Putin, Saudi, and Trump, which is what? The global oil infrastructure, quite frankly, regardless of how many strange oddities are between them. But it's about doubling down more and more fossil fuel guarantees because of this system that does what? It finances the guys that are complete control to own the entirety of the paradigm. So if
Oh,
you
that's beautiful. Well, I will cede to your expertise on that, and I'd be very interested in sort of digging in to complete the picture. But one person who put it beautifully was the somebody who was a protege of Nelson Rockefeller, who, by the way, most people think of him as the governor of New York. They don't think of him as the guy that's sitting on top of this gigantic oil empire. But the protege was a guy whose name was Henry Kissinger, okay? And
yeah,
Henry Kissinger once came out with this huge comment. He who controls the oil controls the world. Bingo.
Look,
And the finances, and yeah,
we've seen $71 trillion manifest into this apparatus since 2009. That's 14 years, $71 trillion into a very tiny scenario of people within the financial system. But none of that is possible. None of that is possible without the global oil paradigm, of which is so enormous via Saudi Arabia, the pipelines, the oil finds, and everything that you've identified, and then through the geopolitical areas, hotspots that they have to run through. So, given all that, I mean,
yeah.
it's
And I can talk
remarkable.
about Ukraine, I can talk about Afghanistan, I can give you examples there too,
Well,
and
but they're all part of the
Azerbaijan.
same. They're all part of the same geopolitical network, right?
Yeah,
So,
and you use the word, I gotta say, you use geopolitical. You know, most people who study power understand you have to approach a geopolitical perspective. It often is not relayed in the Amazon. I mean Amazon. I mean in the press. Um, that's a whole other story, but that's how you got to look at the world. And the major powers know, but most people don't. They're never. Oh, I was telling you about how I got into a forensic. What was he? An anthropologist or just an expert in investigations. And he was brought in to a trial to prove who was guilty. And he had this one liner. I heard it when I was walking through, listening to TV one day, and I just caught it. His name is Jan Liesma, and he was saying facts, facts on their own uh, are not helpful. It's facts put into context that helps you find the guilty one. And so what we get in the news is just bits and facts. Yeah, history doesn't count, context doesn't count. That's how you got to approach the world. And so I know you, as a person who's looking at fraud, can understand what I'm saying. And you can't understand what's going on in the Middle East unless you know part of the history. That's for sure.
well, but it's also the
Uh,
oldest history in the book. It's smash and grab imperialism and control of resources and the financial barons that are able to manifest that.
yep,
It's
yep,
the military industrial fossil fuel slash finance apparatus is what's ruled the United States
yep,
since at least the 30s, right? But
yep,
yet I keep thinking, are we going to break away from that paradigm? And again, I come from that paradigm. I know that
yep,
paradigm, but I also know the science, and I also understand, where we are and what these guys have manifested. What I'm suggesting, based on your information and what I've seen through my paradigm, or excuse me, through my lens for the last 25 years, is that the powers that be, had to figure out a further way to maintain what it is that you're revealing. And so, in closing, give us some parting words about, what do people need to take away from this? And in your eyes, are there things when people go in to explore your work? I mean, I love connecting the pipeline. I mean, it's connecting the dots. That's what I do all the time. Again, it's the
yep.
forensic audit with the narrative, and then the historical understanding and everything else. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same to me, right?
Look at COP 29. It's happening right now
Bring that all
in
together.
Azerbaijan, in Baku, which is enormous oil port. You know, they're they're having a conference on trying to wean off of fossil fuels. And the protesters there, and they're saying it's ridiculous because the the major powers are still out there. They're still exploring. Then you've got friggin' Trump saying drill baby drill. And so this massive power based on oil and finance and military, they're all connected. They're going to destroy the planet. I mean, they won't even face up to the environmental damage that they're doing. And now, what my book shows is they're behind all these endless wars.
Right.
So,
Right.
educate yourself.
That's what I've been trying to get people out there to understand. The forever wars are tied to the financialization of the construct of the oil paradigm. So,
Yeah.
that was a beautiful way to end it. But you hit something that kind of dumbstruck me for a second. I got to kind of noodle through what I'm thinking, because there's so much again, we could discuss. But I guess I just want to ask you this. So again, tell our viewers and everybody out there where they can find your book, because everybody's got to read this, including myself, as soon as possible. I read the excerpts, but I want to wrap my head around everything that you present. Where do we find your book?
Well, the easiest place, obviously, is Amazon. Whatever you think about it, it turns out that my publisher actually prefers people to go to Amazon, and the reason is they have to buy so many books and they won't return them. Okay, that's why she likes it. Also, Chelsea Green, chelseagreen.com is the publisher of the book, and you can always order it. By the way, there's a wonderful, wonderful audio version. I really love it. I've even talked to the woman who did it, and she was saying that lady knows her stuff, and she enjoyed doing it. So if you like audiobooks, I think you can get them for free. Not that I want people to always get audiobooks, but those who are, living outside of the United States, that's one way of getting it. But you can order it through your local bookstore, and that's how you can get it.
And it's Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy, unbelievable story, and Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil by Charlotte Dennet, and the forward by her brother. I take it Daniel C. Dennett III. Is that correct? Was he your brother who
He,
just recently passed away?
yeah, yeah. He's a he was a world famous philosopher, and one of the four horses of atheism, as they say. He was into Darwinism and evolution and using science to understand the world. So, yeah, he was super well known among actually scientists and philosophers and biologists and so on. And his obituary is like all over the place. All the major newspapers talk about his contribution. So he's a real loss. And I was very proud to have him write the foreword of my book. And he does something about Philby, which is quite fun in the foreword. So it's a spy tale, too. Don't forget that. And
Well,
we didn't talk about Afghanistan or Ukraine. Ukraine has the richest deposits of oil and natural gas in Europe next to Russia. That's a whole nother part of it. Why is all
we
the
should we
fighting
should
on the
have
eastern side?
we should have more dialogue, and then I'll continue this for a number of reasons. This relationship, I'm so happy to have met you, and I'll encourage everybody to go out and read the book. I'm going to, and especially your brother as well. After you had mentioned that, but it's interesting that you mentioned that he was an atheist, because the one thing that we didn't discuss here is the psychological manipulation through propaganda of the religious theocracy of it all. Because now, not only do you have all of these players in the Middle East, of course, whether it's Sunni and Shia, and then all things, Judaism, but especially the far right, given Sheldon Adelson, Miriam Adelson's
Yeah,
huge commitment to the settlements and yada yada yada, and a lot of the stuff predicated on the same stuff, right?
yeah,
But the one thing that, and we'll finish this off and up, because you said, look, they're killing us in the world and the planet. Yeah, the one planet that we know that actually can house life, and in a seed of infinity. But from the position of what they call Armageddon or the rapture, and you have
yeah,
this connection between the far right Christo nationalists, really kind of throughout the world, but primarily because of this whole MAGA sort of movement. But they have been for years now connected to the hardline right in Israel. And I wonder, have you come across throughout all of this stuff that how much or percentage has this been this manipulation that in order to create the second coming, that there's this play to clear out that it has to be the land populated for Jews, right? Isn't that the whole biblical sort of scenario within those two constructs?
well, well, Christian Zionism has now been allied with Israeli Zionism, and there it is right in the Middle East, and there are all the prophecies and so on. But what I wanted to say, the earlier book that we wrote about, it was about the genocide of Indians in the Amazon, and we were looking at Christian evangelical missionaries who worked with these tribes and turned a blind eye. That's why we went in there. It took us 18 years to find out who was really behind it. And here's the title of the book: Thy Will Be Done. That's from the Lord's Prayer. The Conquest of the Amazon, colon, Nelson Rockefeller and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. And what we found out is that the Rockefellers, and other very powerful corporations that wanted the land used missionaries, evangelical missionaries, to pacify the indigenous people. And once they did that, the indigenous people either became converts to Christianity or they resisted. And if they resisted, then more awful methods were using, like dropping arsenic on riverbanks and smallpox blankets, same techniques that we use in the American West. And when we found this out, and we found how big this organization was, it's called the Wycliffe Bible Translators. In Latin America, it's called the Summer Institute of Linguistics. That's a whole other story. They're now worldwide. And we started warning people. We said, you got to watch out for these evangelicals because they're becoming very powerful in Latin America and they're starting to become powerful in the United States. Well, now look at where we are. I mean, my gosh, the vice president under Trump was an evangelical, and now you've got a Christian Zionist who's going to be the ambassador to Israel, and the Christians that and they're all after the land. That's what they're doing. This whole settlement movement is going to be on steroids now in Israel. And this is so tragic. I mean, there's some wonderful Jewish groups that are protesting them, and I applaud them. I mean, who else is going to take on this power? It's very dangerous, but there's possibility if people just educate themselves
Well,
and then take action.
I'll give you one last thought to consider here, and then I'll look forward to our next dialogue. But I mean, let's consider the idea of the resistance. I mean, we're talking about paradigms here, right? And what I've learned and what I've known my whole life is because I understand corporations, I understand very educated and ambitious people and the roles that they play within a hierarchy. And it's just the antithesis of democracy. And so,
Yeah.
what these corporate situations have done over the course of time, because they're very smart, is they enable these initiatives. And you got to think of it in terms of this to try to close this out, right? So, John Birch Society all came out of Texas oil barons. That came out of Jim Crow. That was part and parcel to the America First, which is the white supremacist, white wing, cacophony that actually literally worked with the Nazis, by the way. And they were the antithesis of they were trying to be isolationists and everything.
Mm.
But when you carry that all the way forward, this isn't anything new. They've just gotten better and more dynamic. And then you lead this all the way, for example, to tie two things that you said together to finish this off. The Supreme Court. We just had the decision of Chevron, right?
Yeah.
In the Supreme Court, which dials into this, not to mention
Oh.
all of their activity down in the Amazon.
Oh.
But who were the back?
And Saudi Arabia, I might add.
Right, right,
Chevron
right,
used to
right. But
be
who funded?
Standard Oil of California, and they're the ones that got the concession in Saudi Arabia.
That's right. And then when you consider who was paying for, the backdoor business with the Supreme Court justices, whether it's Alito, whether it's Kavanaugh, whether
Yeah.
it's Thomas, and a lot of guys tied to the same thing, right? I mean, we're talking about the billionaires that have backdoor. I mean, so if there's anything that I would project to people that are watching and listening to this, is that this is no time, and it wasn't a time before this last election. I mean, now we are in dangerous, dangerous territory because we gave up Congress. We already gave up the Supreme Court. We gave up the media is completely useless, as we've established on this dialogue. And there's so many open-ended questions, but yet it's not rocket science. It's racketeering every step of the way. That's what the whole purpose of the law is, to prevent that. But if the corrupt owns the law, then you're going to have these outcomes. And ultimately, what's been fueling all of this stuff for the last 70 years? Everything you just laid out. That's the paradigm. And what did your dad say at the beginning? We got to protect this at all costs. Okay.
At all costs. And it's continued all the way up to the present. I've seen those terms used. It's a meme. It's still present. And they're going out all over the world.
Well,
Still looking for oil and flipping the bird at all the environmentalists. I mean,
there's no problem. There's no problem. I mean, this is biblical, though. That's the irony, is it is biblical, and I'm not a religious guy. My point being is it's ridiculous that we're manifesting all this stuff. But I'm so grateful for you for the work that you've done. I'm so happy to have gotten to to interact with you on this dialogue. And the first thing I'm going to do is order this book right away, and I'll circle back to you, and hopefully we can have more ongoing dialogue to bring more information to people that need to
Wow.
hear.
Well, I have to say it was a real pleasure for me. It was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so.
So,
And again, everybody, this is Charlotte Dennet. Sounds like,
Dennet.
and then I'll say one more time before we shove off here. You have got, don't run. I mean, don't walk, run to your quickest keyboard and follow the pipelines, uncovering the mystery of a lost spy and deadly politics of the great game for oil. There is nothing literally more important than understanding how this whole thing works if we're going to save the world and our. And
Oh my God, yes.
thank you so much. All the
Thank
best.
you.
I'll
It
be in
was
touch.
great.
I'll send you
See
a
ya.
copy of this. All the best.
Okay.